Hello everybody. So this is the first video lecture on the topic of parenting. And this is the chapter that actually discusses parenting styles and different parenting philosophies. And the last time we were together and we started talking about parenting, I presented this slide as just sort of a place to begin the discussion. One of the things to consider about parenting is sometimes how we do it with our own children is a response or a reflection of how we were parented. So I like to begin this in-class conversation talking about your own parents. Like, what do you think they did right? What could they have done better? What are you likely to pass on? And then a favorite question of mine is, if you had to summarize everything you learned from your parents down into one statement, right, one principle, one value, what would it be? So that was really just from class discussion. Recalling that this chapter, that the whole textbook is built around this theme of choices, we pick up that theme in the context of parenting. And so the first part of your chapter discusses how parenting from a choice perspective, and it just reminds us of all of those choice-based philosophical questions or statements. For instance, that not to decide is to decide. Example of, if you decide not to sit down with your child and help them with homework, then you're effectively deciding to run the risk that they don't do their homework. To decide not to have a discussion with your kids about sexuality is to basically decide that it's okay for them to learn that out on their own, to decide not to supervise, that kind of thing. That's that first one. And the second one is that, parental choices are about trade-offs. You can't do everything the same way you can't do everything at work, or you can't do everything in life. We have to decide. And the example I used was dance or gymnastics. And that was one that my family had to decide. My daughter was interested in gymnastics, and then later on, when we realized she was interested in dance, it was kind of too late, because all of her peers had dance. They were talking like high school, right? She had spent her elementary and her middle school years doing gymnastics. So by the time she gets to high school, the friends that have done elementary and preschool, elementary and middle school doing dance, you get my point, right? You can't do it all. I hesitate to use this term. We talk about parenting mistakes, but I think the reason that I'm reluctant to use the term mistakes is because that's an effort to reframe it. And what reframing means is, there will be things that happen, or decisions we make, or things will happen as our children grow up that we're like, oh, could have done that one better. But reframing simply means to think differently. Like, it's like that you may not have this may not have been had the best outcome, this may not have been the best choice, but you learned something from it. So reframing is simply looking at a situation from a different angle. And caution that the more that we know, some of us, I know this has happened for me, tend to feel like regret or guilt, and that does no good. Feeling regret or guilt over parenting decisions is not advantageous at all. So instead of feeling regret, we could say, I learned from that, and maybe I would have done that different, and then try to make things better. The next point on here, this is ACEs. Parental choices are influenced by society. So again, this is a very basic sociological concept, very, very straightforward sociological idea that we are not parenting in a vacuum. We are part of a culture. There are laws about how we're supposed to parent. There are cultural expectations. There are parental expectations. We really don't get to make all of our decisions are not independent, and that's just a foundational sociological idea that we are limited by social forces. The next point, though, is about ACEs. Parents can and should help children avoid ACEs. And ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences. In this module, there's an exercise where there are 10 questions about the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences. And you're invited to read the list and then make a note or count to yourself how many adverse childhood experiences you have. We don't need to know what they are, because they're often very personal. But the point is that there is an abundance of research that the more adverse childhood experiences a person has, and these are all these are childhood experiences before the age of 18, the more complications, right? So the more complications they will have them later in life. So basically, I don't have it available right now, but the idea is that when adverse things happen to us in childhood, these have lifelong implications for our emotional, intellectual, professional, and relationship development. So some of the examples are, did a parent or other adult in your household swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you often or very often? One of them is, was a household member depressed or mentally ill? Or did a household member attempt to commit suicide? These are considered adverse childhood experiences that will have implications, or potentially can have implications, for your adult life. And part of what we're supposed to do as parents is we are supposed to protect our children from these adverse childhood experiences. Now, having just said that, there's also this notion that sometimes people, if an individual is personality is a very sort of perfectionist oriented, we can sometimes feel like we're not doing it right. Parenting is hard, and it is from the moment those children, that you will always be a parent. You will always worry about your kids. And so sometimes it's better for us to hear that good enough is good enough, right? That we cannot be perfect parents. Nobody can be a perfect parent, but we should be good enough. And I really like this quote on this slide, that there's no such thing as a perfect parent, so be a real one. And what that means is, when we make mistakes, it's okay to acknowledge our mistakes. It's okay to say to our kids, I overreacted. I'm a human too. And we'll talk more about that in a couple other slides. But there are fours, right? There are 4 C's about good enough parenting. What does it mean to be good enough? Good enough is not just, this is all I want to do, but there are 4 important elements: care, consistency, choices, and consequences. A good enough parent will provide care, emotional and physical care, for their children. They will be consistent. And the reason consistency is important is because the purpose, what parents are supposed to do is mold the next generation, right? And one of the things that promotes well-being is predictability. So parents must be consistent. They must, to the best that they can, create a world that that children can count on, right? Consistent, so they know what to expect. At the same time, right, what we spend most of our adult life doing is making decisions and choices, right? We can be good enough parents, give their children opportunities to learn how to practice making choices, because the world is full of choices, full of decisions. And if we don't help our children practice making choices, they'll go into the world and be completely paralyzed. I do have an experience where my niece, my foster daughter, she was also my niece, right? When she came to live with us, she had been given very few opportunities to choose, to make choices, even like when they went to a fast food restaurant. And I can remember taking her to a restaurant, and she would be utterly overwhelmed by deciding what she was going to order, say at Wendy's, because she simply had not been given an opportunity to choose. Consequences, right? The world is full of consequences, because part of what parenting is about is preparing our children to make decisions and to understand that our choices have consequences. So we provide emotional support for them. We help them understand that the world is reliable, or at least some people are reliable. We empower them, we give them opportunities to make decisions, and we help them understand that those decisions have consequences. And I'm going to stop this first video lecture right here.